Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Will Eisner. I assume that most of you who are in this room know something about him, but
Will who?
for purposes of the conversation, let me at least posit that Eisner was unique in that he had two moments where he had dramatic effect on the comic book industry as sort of peak moments. Many other things that he contributed along the way, obviously. But there's a moment in the early 1940s when Eisner is doing the Spirit for the Register Tribune Syndicate as a insert to go into newspapers across the country, that he seizes the opportunity of what appears to be a familiar form, but he notices what makes it unique. There are, by this point, dozens and dozens of comic books coming out on the newsstand across the country. And the audience for them isn't 100% clear, but certainly includes kids as well as adults. And the literacy level of adults in America in the early 1940s is not particularly impressive on average. So the comics aren't the fanciest form of literature, to be kind to them. But Eisner sees in the medium the potential to be true art, to be true literature. And he sees that because the way the Register Tribune is distributing the Spirit, it's capable of being more than a newspaper comic strip because it has length to work with. Newspaper comic strips at their most had a full page on Sunday and tiny little strips for the other 6 days of the week. Eisner had 7 or 8 pages to tell his Spirit stories. And second, that as opposed to the comic books, these were not being bought. Got your newspaper, and you got this as a free bonus. So the audience certainly included many, many adults in it, and all family. And it wasn't vulnerable to the same tides of commerciality. So that if he aspired to do something that we hadn't seen before, this was about as safe a place as possible, that there was a real way to reach out and pull it off. And then, obnoxious as it is to the rest of us who have never achieved that kind of level of accomplishment at any point in our life, almost 40 years later, as a man of 60, he puts out A Contract with God, which becomes a seminal work for the graphic novel movement, the work that many of the creative people in the industry would look to and say, oh my God, if he can do that, and I'm spending my time doing this nonsense that is birdcage liner, maybe I should try to do something more important. Jules, you were there at the beginning. You started working with Will just after the war, right? You were 17 or 16 when you started out as his assistant?
16 and a half. I was out of high school. And
So,
I did a job.
Conversations that you had at that point with him.
Conversations you had.
Tell us about what
Well,
Will expressed about what he wanted to do.
You know, I don't know that I can in terms of what he wanted to do, because what he wanted to do to me was clear on the page. But it was clearer on the page to me as this punk kid going into the office looking for a job than it was to any of the people who were professionals working for him in the next room, who thought Eisner represented the past and this was just a gig they were on, and they were on something else that would really be important and stylish. I saw him, and I was still just like graduating from my little boy stage, as magical, and using a form. Well, you know, most of the comics that were appearing in comic books at the time, and the Spirit was a comic book, were 6 or mostly 8-page panels on the page. Eisner, for whatever reason, decided to tell his stories sometimes in 9, 10, 12, all squeezed in together. And it was a look that comic book page never had before. And within that look, he got all sorts of action going on and byplay, the sort of screwball movie comedy that was in vogue at the time. Eisner picked up for his strip, and between men and women, between the spirit and the female characters, whoever they were, he would have this banter going on back and forth as they were trying to steal from each other, as she was trying to rob him, and she was hitting him over the head with a vase. They were making wisecracks. It was pure movie stuff. And as I say, many panels on this page, nothing looked like that. Nobody had ever tried anything like that. And it was, for me, from the time I first started noticing the spirit, when I was about 12 or 13, I suppose, or maybe before, it was magical. And who knows what gave him that inspiration, but it certainly started inspiring others. Story was a big deal to him. Story was important. And within that, what was most important was the relationships between the characters, which in most other comic book characters was nil. They were there for figureheads to show off the fight that was about to start to happen. But Eisner's characters had relationships. It was a thrill to read, and later on, it was a thrill to be working for him.
You go on in that period to write some of the stories for the Spirit. Obviously, you had to earn your freedom to do that by erasing pages or cleaning up the office in the usual fashion. But one of the things that Will had as a distinctive superpower was his ability to spot talent. And he saw in you as a very young man a hint of the amazing level of accomplishment you've achieved in your life. You know, you're absolutely unique as a cartoonist in the number of media that you've triumphed in, been celebrated in, and how versatile your skills have proven to be. Will saw some hint of that in some magical way. And are you 21 or 20 by the time you start writing a spirit story or two?
No, by 21, I think I was drafted into the Army. So I was doing it before then. One of the things I loved best was not Eisner's art alone, but the interplay of narrative and art, and how he told a story visually as well as through the dialogue, and the dialogue was terrific. And when he was deciding to move away from the Spirit and try to make a success in the corporate world as a businessman in something god awful called American Visuals Corporation, but he wanted to spend less of his time on the Spirit and more to enter the corporate world. Eisner had a very mixed feeling about comic art. He loved doing it, and he also felt somewhat inferior doing it. That the real businessman, the real corporate people, the real successes were in another line of light, line of art or a line of life. And he, in writing and drawing his work, was at the top of his game and took it very seriously. But once it was done, he didn't believe that he was playing with the real boys. The real boys had big businesses and corporations like American Visuals Corporation. which was Eisner's and which we never really got going. And so he, in order to spend more of his time doing American visuals and some of this other corporate crap he was interested in, he had to find somebody to help him out with the spirit. And I was there in the office, and I was the only one in the office who had a kind of emotional history with the spirit that no one else had. I mean, to the other people in the office, it was a job, and to me, it was my life. It was why I wanted to be a cartoonist. I mean, there were 2 or 3 people that made me want to be a cartoonist, and Eisner was certainly notable among them. And this was a privilege, and I knew how to, from his past stories, know how to get him back to the kind of spirit stories that I used to read, but he was no longer writing. And that's what I was trying to do. Take Eisner back, whether he liked it or not, to what I considered the best of his past in the 1940s, before he was drafted into the army, and bring the stories back with that kind of feeling and that kind of charm and that kind of excitement and originality. And to some extent, I could do it, and to another extent, without knowing it, I was turning it into the Jules Pfeiffer story. So there you go.
What you just said is fascinating to me, because he's not on the panel today, but we had Frank Miller speaking here a little earlier today, and forgiving Frank his connection to the spirit, because that was not his glorious moment. I get my royalty checks every year for the one line I spoke in the movie, and I will happily sign it over to anyone for their not watching. But when Frank worked on Batman with a radical new take, he talked about taking Batman back to where he had been. And you can't really find Frank's Batman, I would argue, in the earlier Batman. It's a revolutionary step forward. Hearing you say about taking the spirit back to where it was in the early 1940s, I think the period when you're working on the spirit moves radically forward from the early Eisner spirit. The emotional byplay you're talking about certainly is present in some of the early 1940s Eisner work, but the radical creativity of the way you played with time, the way you played with the fairy tales, the way you created a different narrative voice in some of the stories in the late 1940s is way beyond what the early spirit had. It's a courage that nobody was displaying in the comics at that time.
Well, partly that displayed, I think, through something other than the influence of Eisner, because in addition to loving Will's work, I loved old-time radio dramas, particularly created by a man named William Spear, S-P-I-I-E-R. And he did a show called Suspense every week. And there was a half hour, and it seemed like a half-hour dramatized movie with background music. But it created coming out of the radio pictures in your mind. And I learned a lot about storytelling from listening to those old suspense shows. And then Spear also did the Private Eye drama, The Adventures of Sam Spade, based on Dashiell Hammett's Private Eye. And all of that taught me a different way of storytelling, a different way of approaching character and sneaking humor in, and making it a movie on paper.
So it's fascinating. The power of the radio drama in part is, of course, it's driven by the spoken word. So
Yes.
dialogue has to carry the story. There were some minor special effects, gunshot or something, but what they called Foley work. But it's the verbal byplay that makes it magic. That's so antithetical to what was going on in most comics in that period that it makes perfect sense that that's what you reacted to and you sort of projected. You saw the seed of that in what Will was doing, married that to what you had heard there, and viewed that as a combined inspiration. That's cool.
Well, I love story.
Okay.
And anything that seemed closer to things I recognized as a Bronx boy during coming out of the years of the Great Depression, as close to my own story, close to the real life that I actually lived as opposed to the one I fantasized. What Will did in the Spirit pages, Will was a boy from the Bronx. I was a boy from the Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
When I looked at those Spirit pages early on, I recognized my Bronx. And I mean, Central City was not Central City so much as it was mixed up with the part of the Bronx that I came from, which was a different part of the Bronx that Will came from, but he didn't fool me. And now Bob Kane with Batman came from the same high school Will did, and his Gotham could not have been more different from Will's Central City. So these are two minds going in using the same background, but going in completely different directions because one of them was a real artist and the other was a hack.
There's so little of Bob in the body of the early Batman work, even when he was working on it himself with his own hands. It was so heavily borrowed from the Shadow. It was so heavily leaning on other people's source material. He gets some credit reasonably for the synthesis he put together, and for bringing in Bill Finger, another graduate of DeWitt Clinton, part of that crowd. But there's an the reason we titled this panel about Will being the poet laureate, there's an authenticity to what Will was doing, both in the spirit, as you're talking about the Bronx influence on it, and then much later in Contract and his graphic novel work, where he really captures the immigrant experience of that period in a way that we didn't have anyone daring to do in the graphic novel in those early years. And we certainly didn't have anyone who had lived that body of experience bringing it to it. I think Joe Orlando, who was my first mentor, taught me that the reader smells sincerity better than competence. And they would rather have sincere, passionate work by someone just learning how to do it than fabulous technical craft work by someone who's batting it out. And what you were just saying about Will versus Bob, rest his soul, was mostly interested in what the paycheck was and how fast he could get other people to do the body of the work for him. Although Will ran a shop, he ran a shop that was his work. He assembled the pieces of the team and put his indelible stamp on each piece of it, working your team together to create his stories.
Well,
is it?
I think one of the answers to the question about Will is that whatever he was doing, it wasn't enough. He was not satisfied. He wanted to push the boundaries, he did not know where, but he just wanted to push them and stretch them and play around with them, fool with them. I must say that the graphic novels he did, I was not that much of a fan of. The artwork is beautiful, and and he keeps trying to move the barrier. Will was always trying to make it different, even when it was good enough. And his mind always stayed that way. We long after I stopped working for him, we remained friendly. And the conversations with him when I was then in my 30s and 40s were just as interesting as the ones we had when I was a young Altacaca.
Would the graphic novels have been better if Will had tried to assemble a studio again? You know, I can make the argument with a straight face that, for those of you who don't know, that there were many studios, many shops in the early days of comics, and many of them, including Eisner and Iger, which is Will's effort before The Spirit,
Yes.
were very much mass production. You're okay at doing heads, you can do a nice background, you do this, but the main goal was how many pages we can produce in a day. It was very much Depression-era sweatshop thinking. There were a few of the shops that aspired to more or aspired to a style, but none of them achieved what the Spirit shop did in terms of a true synthesis of talent. Would Will's work on the graphic novels have been better if he had tried it with a modern shop, putting a team together again?
What the other comics were turning out, and some of them very good ones, was essentially hack work. And they had, whether it was DC or Marvel or, excuse me, whichever it was, they had their corporate way of doing things. Will wanted to give us some magic, and he did.
I want you to flash forward to the time of the graphic novel. You published Tantrum at almost the exact moment that Will publishes A Contract with God. Tantrum is in many ways absolutely as much a graphic novel as Contract. It deals with some themes that had not been able to be touched in comics before. You utilize the space of a physical novel to tell a longer story than you had ever told before as a cartoonist, if I'm right. And Tantrum didn't go in the history books. I don't know that it may have sold better than Contract with God, because heaven knows Contract with God did not sell more copies than we've had people attending this weekend, I think. I don't know how Tantrum did. Were you aware that Will was working on Contract when you were doing Tantrum? Was there any relationship between the two of you striving to break the boundaries at the same moment in different ways?
Well, when I was doing Tantrum, I was not aware of the work Will was doing at the same time with his early graphic novels. And I thought of this as the first graphic novel. Of course, it had been preceded by Milt Gross's She Done the Wrong, or He Done It Wrong, and other artists. But I wasn't thinking in those terms in those years. But I thought of Tantrum as a novel in cartoon form, and with a different one panel on each page instead of many panels, and telling the story in the best way I knew how to tell it, and make it fun and make it exhilarating for the reader. I love drawing Tantrum because first of all, I gave up the idea of doing rough sketches and outlines. That every page was a finished page, and there were no layouts. There was no penciling. Everything was done in pen and ink the way I later worked all the time, the way I work to this day. Because I wanted a sense of spontaneity, and I think I achieved it there.
Did it have any level of commercial success? The bookstores didn't know how to handle graphic novels or graphic literature in 1978.
I've done so much work that's both succeeded and failed, and more times than not can't find out the difference between why this worked and why that didn't work, because whether they failed or succeeded, they all were special to me.
Okay. So this isn't an Eisner question, but it will link to an Eisner question. You have triumphed in more creative fields than anyone who has ever done comics. It's a matter of record, sir. Therefore, I think it's reasonable to believe that you have a deeper creative understanding of the potential of the different media forms, maybe than anybody alive, maybe anybody who ever played in it. What is it about comics that you've turned back to do graphic novels in recent years? What is it intrinsically about the medium that you think offers something better, different, attractive to you as a creator than the many other fields that you've worked in?
I love the other forms I worked in. I love writing plays. I love writing screenplays, children's books, and illustrating them. I loved all of that. As I aged, it seems that I went back in terms of what was really important to me and what was most important to me to the beginning. That in my 80s and 90s, it was the work that interested me when I was 4 and 5 that I wanted to return to. Not because necessarily I thought this is my best stuff, but because I felt it was me at my most natural. This is, it was the purest me. And I can't explain it more than that, other than when I first saw my first comic strips, they blew me away. And the form, in later years, after doing plays and other things, kept drawing me back to it and drawing me back to it. And now I can draw in ways and in styles that are very different from my original approach, and I'm still playing with it. I'm still learning how to do the damn thing.
I think you may be perfecting and experimenting, but I think learning probably is not a fair word for someone with the level of mastery that you've got. Because if you're still learning, the rest of us really should be applying for kindergarten while you're finishing off your 3rd or 4th graduate degree.
Well,
We're switching into
I'm now writing.
switching interpreters for a moment.
What were you?
A last
finish?
point on Will, and then we'll try and get a couple of audience questions in.
Okay, sure.
You lived in the same Bronx environment that he did. And as you say, you felt that there was an authenticity to his work, the spirit, and afterwards that came out of that. That environment gave us so many of the early creative people in comics. So many of them Jewish, not all of them, but this is a Jewish event, a Jewish comic convention.
Was that a question?
You're a living witness to that process. What was it, if anything, that you can put a finger on about the Jewish environment of the time that stimulated the creativity above and beyond that of the other ethnic groups? We know part of the reason there were so many Jews in the early comics was we couldn't get work in the better areas, but there clearly was a creative energy there.
Well,
What gave us that?
You may not recall, but I was the one who blew the cover on Superman and wrote about Siegel and Schuster's hero being Jewish. I think that a big part of all of this has to do with living your early years during the Great Depression. I was born in 1929. And actually, I was born the same month that Popeye, the character Popeye, was introduced into E.C. Segar's Thimble Theater comic strip. So it's almost as if I was fated to, one way or another, enter that world that I loved so dearly as a kid, and I love no less as an adult, but in a different way. And it's part of telling this, part of what attracted me to Eisner in the first place, was that he told stories. He knew how to tell a story. And a story wasn't just like an ordinary comic strip of a hidden, slam bang. They were fables. Eisner wrote fables, and he got me interested as a boy cartoonist in the fable game. How do you take he and she and have them in opposition and have them go against each other and have them have a romance, and that's just the way the movies did. The movies of the 30s and the 40s. All of that, all of these lower class forms were my education and my inspiration. And just as the popular songs of the day were inspiring to me. Fred Astaire in the film, I have endless drawings of Fred Astaire that will appear in my new book, because there was the spirit of getting out of the Great Depression. Pick yourself up, brush yourself off, and start all over again.
I'm just smiling at the thought of your fascination with Fred Astaire and connecting that to the Pfeiffer dancers that that you did so magically.
Thank you. But without Astaire, there were several people that simply were the role models for me, just as Will was, just as Milton Caniff was, who did Terry and the Pirate. And one was Fred Astaire from the very beginning. And there were other movie idols at the time: Bogart, the tough guy, Cagney. They all became role models to me in terms of creativity.
Cool. Okay, we have a few minutes, I think. Gabriel, I don't know when we've got to stop, but we've got a few. And we can probably get a question or two from the audience if anybody wants to walk up to this. Do we have the side mics up or? Yeah. Cool.
Hi, thank you. I've recently been thinking about comic book history and the similarities to the Jewish history and the diaspora. And the point that you were talking about how Will Eisner always imagined and desired for the higher art world or for the greater population to acknowledge and accept comics as high art as well. And that made me think about the goals of assimilation and Jews' goals to be accepted and become a part of the general population. And I'm wondering if you saw or you think that there's a similarity in those desires.
You know, clearly there's some
No,
parallel in all of that.
Just tell me the essence of the question.
If there was a similarity between Eisner's desire for comics to be accepted as high art by the greater population, a parallel to Jews wanting to be accepted by the Western world and assimilated.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Parallel to what?
To Jews' general desire to be accepted as part of the mainstream population of the Western world.
Well, this was Eisner's curse. He was doing the best innovative work in his field that anybody was doing in any other field, but he felt he wasn't the real thing. He was easy. Will wanted to be a businessman. Will wanted to be, thought the real success was not to be doing comics, but to maybe be publishing comics. He wanted to do his version of Life magazine or Look magazine, but he wanted to do something. Comics did not have the prestige that Will wanted and felt he needed. And comics did not have the aura of seriousness. So while he was the best or among the one or two best in the field, he never felt legitimate. And it was, I spent a very uncomfortable evening once with Will and Bern Hogarth
I'm sure.
at Will's house. I was driving back from the country and got tired, called up Will, asked if I could stop by. And he said, yeah, Bern Hogarth is here. And Hogarth, who was the founder of the Cartoonist and Illustrator School, which then became the School of Visual Arts, and was the illustrator of the very white, muscular imperialist Tarzan, beautifully drawn, was sitting there being totally patronizing to Will and smug and subtly and not so subtly finding ways of putting him down. I couldn't stand Hogarth, and I couldn't stand what was going on. And so I later discovered that Hogarth, who called himself Bern Hogarth, was really a Jewish boy. And I have it here. His name at birth was Spinoza Bernardo Ginsburg. And but it pained me how successful the put down of Will was. And that's why I got into this. I started drinking and got into this fight with Hogarth. I forget what it was about, but I was willing to punch him in the nose because he was, he couldn't hold a candle to Will, and he was acting quite superior, and Will was accepting his superiority.
Oh.
That was a curious thing about Will, that it was, he could be thrown off his game because what was really legitimate, which was his work, he never suspected, he never really quite accepted his own legitimacy.
I blame Anne's father a little bit for his father-in-law, who was a constant pressure on Will to get an honest job.
There we go.
Not a believer in the cartooning as a route to success. I think that may have been a major factor in his American visuals detour in life. But
Well,
our family.
that says it.
Can we get another question? And then I think we probably have to surrender the room to the next bit of fun. There we go.
Thank you.
First of all, Mr. Pfeiffer, I found it fascinating that going back to comics was like your Rosebud, like you're going back to the time when everything was simple and everything was the purest form. It was just a beautiful, beautiful thought. But I wanted to ask you, Mr. Levitz, I remember reading in a Batman annual, they had a stack a long time ago, a stack of the daily comic strips. And I was thinking to myself, if I had to read one of these every day, I'd lose my mind. And I don't understand, because comic books, superheroes stepped off of that and into comics. But I'm wondering what kind of, what other than, like, I don't know, other than things that are silly comedy or romance, what kind of things really can function with just three, as a story, not as a picture?
Well, I mean, Jules spoke about Kniff, who was one of the brilliant storytellers who made that form work in the dailies. I wrote a Superman newspaper strip for about 2 years, and I think I wrote it really badly because I found it that kind of unnatural form. You can progress a story bit by bit in snippets like that. We're seeing a lot of that take place in how things are being done on the web, but it's a much more natural form for humor. Not shocking that Peanuts should be the great success of that field. But there have been adventure strips, when it was a great enough master, that worked for a number of years.
Well, that's one of the things about the
Gasoline, where he got a voice for Gasoline Alley from the seats.
There's something of the pacing that you have to learn, like to have things. I mean, it's some great stories. If I'm not mistaken, the whole idea of the Penguin running for mayor began as a comic strip. That was originally a comic strip story, and it was it's been a long-running theme.
I defer to Jules certainly on this, but every form that you can create in is natural for certain kinds of stories and more awkward for other kinds of stories. And no one used the weekly comic strip space the way Jules used it on Village Voice for many years. It's not a form that is intuitively natural for many creators to work in, but it worked for Jules's voice. He made it his own, and no one perhaps has done the same thing. Kniff did that for the adventure strip, not uniquely, but a short list of people. Different forms have different magic, and yeah, you can, even if you're not making magic, you can have a good idea like the Penguin running for mayor,
Right.
but it doesn't execute as well in that form as it does in another.
Well,
And
Paul,
to some extent, we search for the forms we can work best in. Jules, if you had to, of the many forms that you've worked in,
let me.
and this is a great last question. What form do you think you were at your best in?
I'm not going to answer that question because I want to.
Such a good question.
I want to talk about the comic page and the comic strip itself and how many forms. If one looks up, if one goes back and looks at the Sunday pages of Gasoline Alley by Frank King in the 30s and the 40s and maybe the 50s, you see some of the most original visual concepts and playing with space and playing with design and playing with color. And you also find that with, oh God, there were others. I can't think of them at the moment because I'm too goddamn old. But the amount of inventive work done in color on Sunday pages, if you look back at some of it, it can knock your socks off, and it looks as exciting and visually inventive today as it did 50, 60, 70 years ago. It's a wonderful form.
Well, and so when you talk about the color, that they were able to do that with much more primitive tools than what we randomly work with today is all the more impressive. Our clock has run out, I think. Jules, it's always a delight. And it's just always a delight, my friend. And
Well, cool. Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
thank you for sharing some time with us this afternoon. Stay well, keep doing magic, and the rest of us will keep applauding.
Thank you all. Thank you all.